I'm going to talk about open source today. So yes, I am Daniel. I work for Wolf SSL. I am available on Twitter as Bagger, and I work on curl full time, and I'm probably most known for my work on curl. But I'll get into a little bit about other things and why I think I can talk about this topic that I do today. So yeah, and if you have any questions or anything, enter them into the chat or say them to the end or anything or everything. So it's a little bit hard to get them while I'm talking. So I'll have plenty of time after I've said my little thing here. I hope I can manage to talk in about on around 40 minutes and then get some questions at the end. So I'm going to try to get in a lot of things about open source. I'm going to start about some of my experience just to give you more of a background and a little bit of how to start open source people, or working with people in open source maybe, and something about the projects, the money, the source code, and all other details. Well, not all maybe, but a lot of other details, security, maintainership, and a little bit about how evolution has been and might go forward in open source, and something about managing life with while being an open source maintainer. And of course, as I hinted about, I'm going to say a lot of things that I've built up as an experience from all my years of working with open source, maintaining open source, being a contributor and user, and every aspect and angle of open source, because I've been working with this on and off, well, mostly on my spare time, but also professionally for a long time. So I started my entire open source sort of adventure journey experience by a fun project. Well, this is actually the first open source project that I actively contributed to. It was also one that actually speaks TCP IP. It was a Unix portable program. It's called Dancer. It's an IRC bot. And it was while I was working on this IRC bot that I actually got into doing HTTP stuff and web client networking, and that got me into curl later on. And while I was working on curl during those years, I also got into I also co-founded this other open source project called Rockbox, where we reverse engineered MP3 player firmwares, wrote our own replacement, totally open source, so you could flash your own firmware on these MP3 players. And while working on curl, I wanted to improve curl, so I started working on this DNS library and for asynchronous name resolves. And I'm still the maintainer of this CARES project. And also another thing that I got into while working on curl, because I wanted to make curl even better, and I wanted to provide SSH-based powers, so I started working with the libSSH2 project, and I'm also maintainer of that these days. I think I started that maybe 15 years ago or so. So I started a lot of projects, I worked with a lot of projects, and then I also, back in 2014, I also joined and worked on one of the biggest open source projects, the Firefox web browser. And I worked on that for 5 years in the networking team there. Interesting and I got a lot of experience of working with a large, and well, maybe not the project is commercial, but it's trying to make money, and they employ a lot of people who are working with open source. So this is some of my main projects that I've sort of been working with that I'm trying to carry with me when I'm talking about open source today. So let's get started or talk about how to start with open source. I get a lot of questions about how do you start? If you want to ship your project that's open source today, what do you do? And sort of what's the necessary steps? What's the least requirements? How much does it need to work? Blah, blah, blah. And my my advice is always to just do it as soon as possible. Ship what you have, make it available open source as soon as possible. Do not wait for, you just have to clean up the code, you just have to make it prettier, you just have to refactor the functions, you just have to blah, blah, blah. Because no, you really don't. Because if it's going to be open source, I mean, it'll have warts, it'll be quirky, maybe it has issues, there will be problems, but no matter what, you will have them anyway. And opening it up sooner is going to be better than later. And as long as you're frank about the status, and it could be beta version, it could be an early version, try it out, you can just document what to expect. And I think going out early is usually almost always the preferred way to do open source. Just get it there. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of good. And also, as soon as you open it up, you have the chance and opportunity to attract developers and a community, and get it started. If you wait, you also wait to get the starting to build the community. And if you are if you're lucky enough and fortunate enough to start your own open source project and you start to ship it, you can decide yourself, of course, on what kind of license you want for your project. And licenses, that's of course a huge topic, and you can spend lifetimes on debating the ups and downs of the different licenses, and what do you really want, and what's your aim with this project, what do you want your users to have, what permissions do you want to give them with your source code. And of course you want a license that you think others in the community will like, so that they can join your project and participate and contribute and everything. But of course, whatever you do, you should never make up your own license. You should go with one that is a known, vetted open source license, preferably one then that the open source initiative has vetted and acknowledged as a true open source license, because that's what everyone knows, everyone is familiar with, and it'll be the least friction and no bar to climb for contributors. We all know those licenses, so go with one that exists and we all know. And then once you're started, or rather, maybe your entire purpose when you do it open source is to make sure that you attract developers and a community. So make sure that you just, help developers and the community to find your project, get into the project, build your project, use your project, all of that. We find so many open source projects when we who are doing these projects seem to forget that if you just ship out something, no explanation, no descriptions, no sort of explaining why we would use this project instead of another, you really won't get that user base. You won't get a community that you really want. So help the community and your developers to find your project and understand the project. That is sort of the first step to get a successful project. But of course, you can fail in many ways anyway, but you should at least keep that in mind, that you need to help everyone lower the bar, ease the friction. And then, of course, we work with people in open source, right? And working with people is actually the same in open source as virtually everywhere else. It's tricky because humans and people are tricky. Some are hard to work with, some are easy to work with. Some are hard to communicate with, some really can't communicate. There will be really annoying people and downright insulting or offensive people, but they will exist there, and they will come if you have a community that attracts enough number of people, right? So you can and should expect, when you put your project up there, you should expect this negative feedback, because people in general will expect that whatever you put up and provide, it works, right? So as long as it works, everyone thinks that's what it should do. That's fine. No need to tell anyone about that, so you won't hear so much about that. But the second it crashes, it doesn't do exactly what they thought it would do, you will hear about it. So the amount of feedback you get in a typical open source project will, of course, sort of be the most of it will be negative, because it's the negative things that people will react on and come to you and ask for help for. If it all works and all is fine, they won't come back and tell you about it. And not only will it be negative? You can also expect quite an amount of insulting attitude. And this is really just because people are people. So a lot of people think that, well, you promised a functionality. I read it between the lines that it should do this, and it didn't do this. You must be a very unintelligent person who made it this way. So they will tell you in rather aggressive ways that you are wrong and they are right, and they can tell you how to do things. And while a part of that is, of course, about different cultures, we're doing things online, so it's hard to get nuances. There's also the culture barrier. So a lot of these users don't have English as their primary language, so they might use some translation services, or they just translate into wrong words. So that's some of it. But we know that this happens, so just be aware of it. It's going to happen to your project as well. And of course, there's going to be this people going to, as if your project is fairly successful, people are going to use it, and they are going to use it without telling you. I hope this isn't anything new, but it's just a natural thing. So it's really hard to know then exactly how widely used your project is, because you ship it, someone takes it and runs with it, and as long as it works, you might never hear from them again, and you might never know that they're actually using your project. But of course, that's just how it is. And in my case, I usually go back to how do I find out if people are using my projects? I go back to, I watch the questions, of course, because the questions, when people have problems, tend to sometimes reveal where they are from, what they're working on, what kind of products they're working on. And you can always, vanity search on Google to find such things, or you can, as in my case, I have my email address in the curl license. I get some funny emails every now and then that sort of reveals where my products are actually being in use, which is sort of combined, it gives me clues where my stuff might actually be running without anyone actually told me plainly. And other things you should, of course, be prepared to do. I mean, open source doesn't necessarily imply or mean that you should do it on your spare time, but a lot of, at least when you start out, you usually do it maybe spare time. And when your stuff gets spread around, starts to get used, a lot of companies and stuff, I mean, actually paid engineers will work with your stuff without you being paid to work on it. So you get this funny situation where someone is actually getting paid to work on your product while you're doing it on your spare time, and they will ask you for help while they are doing it for a salary, and you're doing it late nights while their family is asleep. And of course, hardly anyone will actually stick around in the project, even if you're doing everything right. There's not a lot of things you can do to make sure that people are actually sticking around, because people are busy. They didn't actually use your project because they want to stick around in your project. They used your project because it solves it solves a need or a function that user wanted. Maybe they fixed a bug, maybe they asked a question or contributed something, but most people just do that and then move on, and they keep using your software maybe, but contributors are hard to actually get to stick in the project and become that regular that you actually want them to be. But of course, you should keep striving at that. So and because of this nature of everyone sort of working on their own itch and scratching their own itch and working on their own sort of goal, you can be certain that sometimes there will show up a newcomer to your project. You can have a project that is 20 years old, say, if you can think of such a project. And sometimes someone who never ever showed up in the project before, you never heard of it, and it's a username called blah blah 1355970, and it could still be that amazing contributor that has actually clearly spent a lot of time. This is a skilled engineer who's written the most perfect patch ever in their first attempt, and maybe that user will never return again, or maybe they do. You just can't tell. I'm just suggesting that it's an interesting world where a total newcomer, someone you never saw before, can sometimes provide the most amazing contributions. You just don't know. You have to be open for that, and every contribution has to stand on its own merits. So even if you've never seen the person's work before, it could be amazing, and sometimes it is. I mean, this is not really an exception. I think it happens quite regularly. But there's also, of course, the more of a, I would say, the reverse kind of people that show up, and these are also kind of frequent flyers in these in projects that they know best, because clearly you didn't think this through, but they have, and they can explain to you how your system is lame, bad, wrongly designed, or just, I don't know, stupid in so many ways. I can't even start to describe it. So they will tell you how the best way is to solve these problems that you have worked on for maybe decades, but they can tell you they started using it 20 minutes ago, and now they can explain to you exactly how you've been wrong all this time. And you just have to acknowledge that these humans exist. They will show up, and of course it's a mighty fine practice in human patience, or to not bite back, and to be friendly, and to ask the relevant questions, and get the technical details out of those discussions, because it can be really hard. And a little bit maybe on the side that a lot of people that show up in your projects, they will actually hide where they're from. Not only where they're from physically or geographically, or in the world, because usually in the open source project you don't really care in which sort of geography they're from, but they will also hide from what kind of company, or the name of the company, or what product they're working on. Slightly hard sometimes to understand why, but sometimes they might not even work. I mean, they could be working on a side project that they don't actually work for company XYZ when they show up, or they work for XYZ, but they don't want to show to the world that they're working with my product for their company, and so on. So there's a lot of, there's a widespread use of Gmail addresses, even if they work for a company, even if they work on your product on paid time. So a lot of hiding where they're from. So that also adds to this I mentioned before about knowing who's using your product. So it's seemingly a lot of people are using, innocent looking anonymous Gmail addresses, but they might be from one of those big companies. You just don't know unless they tell you. And going forward, so, and a lot of time I find this interesting that sort of, I mentioned a few different things there. There's also this sort of reversed compared to the other things I mentioned here, because sometimes when you develop a project, some of your decisions and functions and functionality, it wasn't really well motivated by the time at the time when you introduced the functionality. But if it's been there for a while, a lot of people will assume that it is very well motivated. And I sometimes struggle with this, because if you have a better idea how to do this, you don't actually have to, consider everything. So it's a gentle balance there, because as I mentioned before, some features, we have thought about, tweaked, polished for years, and it perfected it maybe. But some features, it just happens to be there. And it's hard for users to understand which is which. And some users will just think one way, and some users will think the other. It will just happen. And of course, my sort of favorite pet peeve, a lot of people will contact you privately about the project, because they just have a quick question. They don't want to do it in public. They want to hide who they are, where they're from. They just want to avoid going to mailing lists, show their name, show their contact address. They don't want to register their accounts, blah, 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 whatever. So the more popular your project becomes, if you as a person is associated with the project, expect contacts being made sort of in private, or in a lot of other channels that you probably might not want it. And similarly, they will then provide feedback in irrelevant places. They will post it in Facebook posts, or show it on a slide in a presentation in a big conference, or ask questions weirdly phrased on Stack Overflow, and not necessarily provide that back to you. And my favorite is, of course, that a lot of, for example, Linux distributors will have their own bug trackers and everything that will sort of attract bug reports to, and they might not always come back to you, which is annoying, but a fact of life. Also, another fact of life is, of course, that most contributors are still male white Westerners. So the sort of, we're not always as well distributed in the humankind as we want to be, and this is something we need to work on and be aware of. I'm not actually sure what to do about it, mostly because I'm one of those, and my projects certainly suffer from this as well. So we need to, of course, always keep on lowering the bar to attract more contributors and contributions in every way and aspect we can. When we succeed with that, we get better contributors, better contributions, and more of them. And I think that you should, in your project, have a code of conduct. I think that's one of these things that sometimes becomes a little bit, well, sensitive in projects, what to write in the code of conduct and how should you really need it and everything. But I think as with documentation for a project, you should document what to expect your program works and how it will behave. You should document how your project is supposed to behave and how everyone is supposed to behave in your project as humans. So to help newcomers and possible newcomers, should they really even consider your project? If you're a nasty project, maybe they don't want to do that. So at least you should clarify that, what kind of project are you? And projects, there's a lot of things to say about running projects, right? But an open source project is usually just a bunch of random people who have found you somehow and just gathered around a popular topic, a project code, site, service, tool. Just be aware of it. They're easy come, easy go, and you usually don't even know a fraction of these people. They just show up. We have a common interest, this particular project, and people will come and go. I mean, the excellent contribution you got yesterday, you merged it after a long, very productive conversation and discussion. Maybe they will vanish today, and some people will stay around for a decade or two. You never know. And of course, in a project, starting out, there's a lot of, in most projects, there's a lot of writing code, features, doing fun things. But of course, as projects grow, it's sort of, well, cements itself, of course, over time. And the amount of work tends to grow more and more maintenance. And I'll get into a little bit of being a maintainer soon. And of course, documentation is never good enough. What's good with a project that stays and lives for a long time is that you have a long time to perfect the documentation. So after a few decades, it might actually be good, or at least not bad, maybe. And of course, you need to, this is a funny thing, but of course, if it's not alive, it's dead. So a project needs energy, it needs activity, it needs something. You need to refresh it. It needs to happen something, because people will consider your project dead if nothing happens in it. For example, if you haven't done a commit in a year or two, I think most people will think of it as dead, because no currently active, very, very few softwares these days can actually remain sort of relevant and working without activity for a long time. So people will abandon it if it's dead. And of course, old versions never die. As long as you ship the version and it's being used somewhere, you can be sure that someone is still using that version you shipped 15 years ago, and they will show up soon and ask you about it. This happens regularly in projects that I am in. And yeah, well, so therefore we keep on improving, and this is how we eventually possibly reach success also in a open source project. I meet a lot of people who are asking me about how to achieve success, or how to make your project actually end up being used by many people. I don't have the answers or the solution, but I certainly know that by keep on improving, that's really the only chance to make it actually finally reach out widely at some point. You just keep on. You have to have the patience to iterate, improve, release, fix continuously for a very long time, so that you can polish out all the flaws and everything over time. And of course, you make sure that your backyard is perfect, spotless clean. Make sure that you fix everything that is in your project. And as long as we all maintainers of open source projects, as long as we all maintain our own backyard clean, things are good. But of course, being a good citizen in the open source ecosystem, we help out our neighbors. So if we're using dependencies, we're using tools, of course, it's in our sort of benefit to make sure that we help out our neighbors, sort of metaphorical neighbors, our dependencies, tools, everything. Reach out to your neighbors and help them out too, so it'll make your project better. And of course, we participate in open standards, because open standards is an excellent thing for open source. So being part of that also helps you, especially the standards you work with or in association with. So help out there too. I try to often emphasize that the project, any open source project, is we. It's not you, it's not I. So one of my favorite tips is when you communicate with the project, don't say you to the project, call it we. What should we do to fix these problems? I think we should add this in the future. We should make it do this. We should fix this problem. Our problem is this, not you or I. And I guarantee you that it'll be a much better communication. Avoid computer license agreements, because they are not appreciated by contributors, because of it makes the whole thing uneven, the situation, the roles in the projects. When it comes to money in an open source project, it's a difficult area. So let me go through this quickly. I don't have the answers on how to fix open source sustainability, of course. But first, I just want to make sure, of course, that open source often have a lot of volunteers, and volunteers make things in a project very differently than a project that is run, by when you have employees working for you. So people come and go, and you don't really know what to expect from them. Maybe they vanish. You don't know if they will deliver or won't deliver. And money here is also difficult, because if you're involving money, who's getting money and for what? Getting money from companies for this open source project is also difficult, because companies tend to pay for something that they can get. So it's fairly easy to get companies to actually pay for new features in a project. They can, contract someone to add feature X to your project, but very few companies will pay you whatever money to just maintain something for a long time so that they can keep using it. You will find that's a much harder sell, and that requires much more convincing. And of course, a lot of companies rather not say, sort of what I mentioned before, that they are actually using your project or that they are contracting you to write features. I have actually written many open source related features for companies, and they basically told me, don't tell anyone, you own everything, so you can say that you did all the commits, that's fine. So donations are hard to get from companies, and you will learn that donations are primarily done by individuals, and individuals tend to give a lot less money than companies can pay. So if you rely on donations, you rely more on humans, and more individuals or private persons. So it's actually quite hard to get to finance your project on donations. And also a lot of times you start to talk about how to charge things in an open source project, but it's usually very hard to start charging for something or start working in a project, transition from a completely spare time to maybe pay time, because everyone who is already participating in your project is working somewhere already. So they're already on someone's, they're already getting paid. They're employed by someone. Some of those employers, they forbid you from doing side businesses, or you're already busy enough, you can't take a side gig. So it's hard to take off from there. And of course, getting paid, it also opens up this discussion, who has the rights to the money that you actually get to the project? So how do you actually distribute the money that you're potentially getting? It's a difficult step to take. Many have taken it, but of course, just something to be aware of and consider when you're approaching it. I mentioned distributors absorb bug reports. We never accept undocumented code because we have learned that if you do, you have to document it later, and it'll just give you tears and sorrows. Of course, people will mostly address symptoms when they fix bugs, not actually fix the underlying architecture problems. Only releases gets tested for real. So for a long time, we've tried things like you can do pre-releases, you can have daily snapshots or anything, but it doesn't really matter. It's only the real public releases that will get tested for real. So whatever you do, the really nasty bug reports only ever show up when you've done a proper release. So similar to what I said before, once merged, you own it. You can be sure that a lot of contributors who are very active, seemingly very keen on getting things merged into your project, as soon as you merge it, they will vanish. So here, take it, and then they leave. Commit and run. And of course, the fun thing, this called the Linus law, sometimes given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Maybe not. You will see that bugs can survive for a very, very long time, even with many eyes. I'm talking really fast now because I'm sort of seeing that I'm talking too much with too many bullet points. Security, of course, very important in your project. They will appear as if your project is popular, being used, being scrutinized. You can be sure that you didn't think of everything the best way from the beginning. So they will appear. You can do your best to make sure that they don't. But when they happen, you fix them and you act and you take care of them. One, I think, a way that I like is to provide bug bounties. So that we have in some of my projects, in Curl in particular, we pay quite a lot of money to security researchers who report what is then confirmed as a security problem, because it helps us to really motivate them and give them incentives to spend a lot of time and effort to actually find the problems. And it seems to work, or we just write bad stuff. Okay. And of course, maintaining open source. So this is a typical maintainer in an open source project on the image here. And of course, being a maintainer in an open source project, that's a lot of things. It could be one of these. I mean, these are all different subjects, things that you might need to do in a project. And if it's a small project, as most projects actually are, most open source projects are small, maybe 1 to 5, 10 people actually contributing, but a lot of these chores or tasks need to be done by a small set of people. So that's a lot of things to do to make sure that your project is alive and thriving and is being known out there. So of course, the little part that says feature development in this list, that might not be what you spend the most time of your days on. It certainly is not the most time I spend in my days these days. Sometimes people ask me how much I actually on my work days that I actually write new code, and that's a small percentage of my daily time these days. So a lot of things. Being a maintainer is a lot of things. But all of this said, looking at how the evolution has been for open source over the last, I said 3 decades. I started my first open source in the early 90s. Open source is better and in a better shape than ever. So production, I mean, there's a lot more open source, more, better, larger than ever before. We have better tools, better services. It's lower costs, and we have mostly free or gratis services. We have more languages that are open free. We have a better internet connections. We have we have more computers, we have more phones, we have everything is more and better basically than ever before. And we consume more than we ever did before. We have more companies using more open source. I mean, and the volume of open source is just more than ever. We have more infrastructure to do open source, to use open source, to run open source, websites, issue trackers, version control, communication, CI, deploying, hosting, everything is there and much easier than ever before in history. The tools, mostly them also, of course, in themselves open source. They are also better, faster, and much more quality. I mean, just look at, like in my little world, when we work with compilers, the compilers have developed so much over the last decades, so much better to find more things. They have better warnings, better error messages. They do better things in general. And we have more, we have fuzzing, we have static code analyzers that have become much better. And a lot of this is now offered in the cloud for free usually, or at least at low cost. So things have really evolved in a positive way for open source. And languages, we now have a lot more languages, and so we have not only a variety, and most of them are actually open source. And so it also makes it easier to write open source because we have more choice and we can go with whatever we want and we can still use it. And funding is still hard and difficult for open source, and it has always been, but now at least everyone knows about open source, and people know about funding open source. So even if it's hard, I would say it's still easier than ever before. And now there are also a lot of companies who are mostly working with open source. You can at least now find work at companies that work on open source. So, okay, life with open source, or working with open source, of course, I'm thinking then primarily of things that are then outside your open source stuff. I do regularly get questions about things like these soft issues that are outside whatever you do in front of your keyboards or screens or CI outputs. But what I sometimes come back to is that the silly fact that days are 24 hours for every one of us. So we are all using all time, right? So we only have this. So if you want to do more of one thing, you have to do less of something else. If you want to do more open source, you have to do less something else. It's just as simple as that. So you cannot do more open source without doing less something else. In my case, I usually have tried to do less sleep, less TV, less computer games, less something else, and then I can get more time on open source. But that's a choice we all can do. Sometimes it's not a choice. Sometimes you just have to do it some ways because we're all differently privileged, right? So I would say it's a privilege and a luxury to be able to spend a lot of time on open source. Many of us can't because you have a financial situation, family situation, health situation that makes it impossible for you or your surrounding for you to do that. It's just the sort of unfairness of life, I guess. But of course, health and life comes first, always, even for me who's done this for 30 years. So we need to take care of family and your life and everything. It's just, I don't have to say this, but we just have to do that. It's just natural because, again, open source is usually the luxury point in our lives where we can cut out first, basically, when something else needs attention. So how do you stay sane when you spend a lot of time on open source in your life? Well, in my case, I can't tell anyone. I mean, I can't really help you how to stay sane because I don't know. We're all different. From my case, from my point of view, I stay sane by making sure that my code, whatever I produce, is as good as possible. So I don't have to worry about my code. I don't have to wake up early in the morning and sweating and think about bugs and security problems I've introduced for the world. No, but so I'm pretty happy and safe with my code. So I make sure that the code is fine, so I don't have to worry about that. And I have to accept that it will have bugs no matter what, and sort of learn to accept and filter out the aggressive users and the commenters, the insults and all that. I know that it will come, and it happens almost daily. I will just, ignore that and let it slide. And of course, I use real life and other things outside of the keyboard, outside of open source to go up for air, to get a relief and do other things. That helps me to stay sane, leave it for a while. So that makes me keep the sort of enjoyment and make sure that it's still fun. So that is also a little bit how I think I maintain motivation, because I like happy users. I like striving for perfection. I enjoy software engineering. I like the community, hanging out with fun people and making things together. And then yeah, that's how I do things. I rotate chores and do fun things, boring things, interchange them intermittently, sort of every now and then, to make sure that everything that needs to be done can be done. And again, do things in real life too. Spend time with the family, watch a movie, go kayaking, or whatever. I'm not going to get into my fun emails too much, but because if you want to get into them, I think they're better off when you read them in the book. You go to un.curl.dev and read them. But some of my favorite emails are the one about the Instagram and Spotify hacking ring from a person who had her Instagram supposedly hacked. I have this awesome email in the book about a Toyota Corolla owner who had some problem with his GPS. It's a bit difficult to understand, but it's fun. And also some other examples of fun emails I get just because my email is in the curl license file that appears in a lot of products, and people find that email address when they have problems with those products, and they email me about them. The not so fun email, I will slaughter you, more about death threats and you know, the darker side of being open and accessible and everything. Took me hard at the time. I think I'm over it now. And a little bit about how to respond and how I respond to emails. But usually all of these emails, I rarely respond to them these days because the distance between the person who is emailing me and me is so great that they don't understand why they found my email. They don't understand what my code does in their product. And whatever I tell them, they think of it as a sort of me trying to get away from the responsibility to fix their problems, while I usually don't even know their product they're using or what the problems are. And they're usually not asking about anything I can handle anyway. And I don't have any contacts at the company who makes the product that they have a problem with. So responding is really, really hard for me, at least, as things are. Well, thank you, everyone. Now I'm at 41 minutes. So if you want to read up on what more details, actually, what I've said, and I'm actually going to try to polish my work going forward because I've found a few things that I feel I need to extend and work on going forward. It's on this URL, un.curl.dev. There's a web version and there's an EPUB version. So if you go there, you can find the link to the EPUB version, and it's also updated daily, I believe. So it should be available all the time in a refreshed version. So I guess that is what I wanted to say to you today. Thank you. I think there might be some questions. And if you want to, you can, fire away questions in the chat, or I don't know how we do it.
Yeah, you're welcome to ask questions, just speak out or in the chat. We have some questions that you got before. We can start with them, maybe. Do you have anyone in mind?
Yes, I will. I have some questions. So, as long as you think of questions. So here I see some in the chats. So I will start. I will start out with the ones that you are asking now live, because I think it's more fun because you're here to listen to them. So, what is the best way to start contributing to open source? That's a good question. So when you want to start contributing to open source, I think one of the best things to do is to find a project that you care about, or possibly one that you're using, and maybe one that you're using that doesn't do everything that you want it to do, or it has some quirks or some issues or whatever. And you follow that project, or you join that project. And when I say follow, I mean read a forum, check out the issues. If they have mailing list, more of the old style of projects, follow that, and start out by just becoming a visitor and just see how things are done there. Maybe read up how, watch the tone of the project first, just as a observer. And then, of course, start. If you have a particular issue yourself, you think it's wrong, some spellings in the documentation, when you use this option, you press this thing, it does the wrong thing, it should do this. Work on things that actually affects you, or that you've been annoyed with, because that's the most fun, to start out with what you want to think. And then it's just dive in. Every single project out there loves newcomers and new contributors. So everyone will sort of embrace you and welcome you if you're just doing it, be friendly, be open, and be frank about your situation. And I'm sure people will help you into most projects. So, and do you have any insights on how to market your open source project? That's a difficult question, because marketing an open source project is basically marketing in general. How do you market anything? How do you reach out in a world full of noise? And as I said earlier, so we're in a world where we have more open source projects and more open source volumes and more open source users, more open source producers than ever before. So of course we have, it's I would say, harder than ever to market an open source project. So I'm not a marketer. I don't know marketing. I don't actually know a good answer here, other than the same old thing. Put it out there, start working on it, tell your friends. And if it's good, your friends might start to use it and they might tell their friends. So I think that's the only thing I've done. And I actually don't have any better answer, unfortunately. Yeah, so my main motivation is just to code a lot about how to contribute to open source. Yeah, but then you find a project that needs a lot of code, maybe projects that are early on, and particularly in a language that you like and want to work with. So, okay, how do you manage a long-term roadmap, given that contributors are not staying long and not having a lot of time to work on features? That's really difficult to manage. Well, maybe the roadmap isn't that hard, but it's hard to know when things get done. In my projects, I usually try to phrase things as things we want to do in the project going forward, and I usually put them down as, here are things that I plan to work on coming up next, or going forward, or in the next few years, or maybe something, and other things that we could do in the future, and then just wait for someone to do them. The things I want to do and get the time to do, I do. The things that I don't get around to do, I hope that someone else does. I know this is a pretty lame way of expressing it, but that's how I've done it. So I can rarely actually rely on features just getting done by someone, because I don't know when or how or if they will be done. They then get done very, randomly from my point of view, and spottedly. Sometimes someone shows up and has a huge feature, and sometimes they don't. So I can have the roadmap saying, oh, these are things we want to do in the future, and in the long term, those things will happen because either I do them or someone else does them. We just don't know exactly how long time it'll take. Have you ever given away an open source project and you lost interest in? How did it work? I'm actually pretty bad at giving up maintainership and stop working on projects. I've actually tried to do it somewhat in both CA-REST and libSH2, but I'm still there. I've sort of mostly given up, but I'm still there. So I'm working on that skill. I gave up on the project I mentioned briefly in the beginning called Rockbox, that was a MP3 player firmware, but that's also because of the entire thing about MP3 players sort of moved away. So I've done it a little bit. And maybe I've also sort of gave up on contributing to Firefox after I quit the work, because I did it as a job. I actually haven't contributed to Firefox since I left Mozilla. So, but I didn't. That was not my project to maintain. So it's hard sometimes, especially if a project you worked with for a long time, you have an idea where it is, where you want it to go, and then give it away to someone else, and it doesn't happen the way you wanted it to be. It's a tough situation. So it's hard to just leave it completely and move on. But at the same time, it's also hard to I can't take on everything. I have to leave stuff out from my plate. can you tell about the most remarkable personal benefit you have got from being an open source contributor? Well, I think for me as a person, individually for me, my entire life has been hand in hand with curl. So in my remarkable personal benefit is that I work on curl full time. I work on my own spare time project all day, all full days, every day of the week. So for me, I'm living the dream, and I think that is remarkable. I don't think that's a luxury everyone ever gets to achieve or reach. How is the level of harassment working on popular projects that you are reachable directly? It comes and goes. So sometimes it's a little bit like that. I will slaughter you email I got. I am actually sometimes a little bit too accessible, or people find my email address or me wherever. So it can really get to a really horrible level instantly, or it does not. It comes and goes. And in general, I think it's more like people in general. If many people know your name or know how to contact you, I think you're putting your neck out more. So I don't know how to really. It can get bad. You have to. But that's how human works, right? Or work. So I work hard at ignoring unpleasant or rude people, and of course I'm sure that I'm also in a fortunate position because I can do this, and I'm safe, and I feel sort of sure on myself and secure in myself enough to do that. So I'm sure that others will find it more problematic or be in more problematic situations. So that can be tough for some, but I think it's just something we have to work with, because I don't find any other alternatives how to do things. I also like to be open, to be there, to be reachable, because most of the contacts I have, and I have contacts with users quite frequently. I mean, 97% of everything is very positive and optimistic. And a lot of what drives me and what gives me motivation and energy, and to get up in the morning and spend all day on tearing my hair out for fixing bugs. That is the positive and the optimism and talking to people, because they're happy, they have things, they work with things, and they're so the communication and the dialogue with people, that's also extremely fun and satisfying and rewarding. So the bad things are just, I don't know, wouldn't know how to avoid the bad things without also sacrificing all the good things.
Great. Do we have any more questions?
I will then just check out the other questions that I had here.
Good plan.
So I think there are 5 questions. So if you have any more, ask them in the chat. And so these are questions that we got beforehand. So someone who I actually don't have their names, but I had the questions from someone who submitted this when they registered for this presentation. So what's your advice for younger folks who wants to follow an open source career? A little bit about how to, similar maybe to how to get into open source, but if you want to work with open source as a full-time job, gig, whatever, I think in my case, I work with my own project, and I think that is a rare luxury. I think in the it's more easier, maybe not that easy anyway, but to find a project that, to find companies that work with open source or produce open source themselves, and then try to find jobs at those companies, like one of the Linux distributors, one of the other big products that are open source, maybe some other things around the new popular languages, whatever, anything that is open source, if they are looking for new people, go look for work there. I think that's a good entry point for someone who is young. And I think I got into this, what's the secret to manage to keep running a project for so long? I don't have the secret. There's no secrets at all. It's just a lot of hard work, patience, endurance, keep on, and never give up. Because if you never give up, you have never failed either. So just keep on it. I often mention when I talk about curl in particular that you might consider curl as somewhat of a success. I certainly do, but I mean, it took many years until it actually reached the level that someone would even consider it a success. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in 1 year. It didn't happen in 2 years either. It probably took like 5 or maybe 10 years until it reached a level of success that we all could agree is a success. So my biggest motivation, I don't know. I sort of got into that a little bit before. And here's the question about long-term plans for open source project. We talked about that. So it's hard to do long-term things or relying on people's presence. If you're lucky, you get a bunch of people who are contributors who stick around, and you sort of get to know them. Then you can be fairly sure that they will stick around for another month or two, because they did it for the last few years. So maybe they will go on like this for. And if you have a communication with such contributors, you can be more, you can plan better and rely more on their contributions going forward. So it all depends on your project, because I mean, it's not only you maybe who's going to participate in your project going forward. You can be a whole team that are all participating under the same conditions. So maybe you will all drive your project forward. So then you can pretty much expect or hope or presume that they will also contribute good stuff going forward. And I think that's the last question I had. And there's no new one in the chat either. There is no new ones.
Yeah, and I can mention, if anyone wants to contact Daniel, I will email his contact information after this webinar. And we will also upload the recording on our YouTube channel if you want to watch it later again, or if you want to share it with someone. So you will get all this information later today. And if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank you, Daniel, for your time and for sharing your thoughts and experiences. And yeah, thank you for a great webinar.
Thank you, everyone.